everyone. I'm just going to make sure. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So my name is Angela Cassie. I've been with the Canadian Museum for Human Rights now since 2008. So I'm speaking from direct lived experience with some of the lessons that we've learned, some of the challenges that we've encountered, and some of maybe the lessons that we would like to now share. I present this with a tremendous amount of humility. I think the reality of public engagement is it's not a cookie cutter approach. Every situation is unique, and we can learn from each other. So I hope that what I can share with you today helps inform your own thinking and your own practice. And as we go to the Q&A, perhaps we can continue to learn from each other. So before I begin, I would just like to acknowledge that we are here on Treaty 1 territory in the homeland of the Métis people, and just want to acknowledge that these lands where we are have been and continue to be of significance to Canada's Indigenous peoples, and we have also the honor that the museum is located on these lands and on this territory, so I just want to begin with that acknowledgement. So how many of you, I know there's something planned later on today, but how many of you have already visited the Canadian Museum for Human Rights? Okay. How many of you are from Winnipeg? Okay. And let's say we'll do a Canadian thing. Who's from the west? West of Winnipeg? Okay. Who's from east of Winnipeg? Okay, and who's from the north? Okay, great. So we're pretty well represented in the room. That's lesson one of not how to do public engagement. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about some of what we encountered. And being a government agency, very often when you do public engagement, you say, well, we talk to the west, we talk to the east, we talk to the prairies, we talk to the north, check. And I'll talk to you a little bit about how we try to challenge a little bit of those generalized assumptions that everyone from the middle of Saskatchewan to Victoria have common perceptions, common lived experiences, and a common lesson to share. But the museum opened its doors in September of 2014, so we've just marked 3 years since inauguration. And we're an ideas museum. I'm just going to provide a little bit of the history and the context, so we're starting from the same base of knowledge and understanding. We are an ideas museum, and we're centered around the complex concept of human rights, a topic that we recognize is very important to Canada's national identity, but also has quite a universal relevance. And so we have already encountered a lot of visitors from all around the world who have come to the museum to learn more about Canada, and I'll touch base a little bit on what we encounter in the international scene when people come to visit the museum. We developed a museum with no collection at its basis and a mandate to engage the public in an important discussion in participatory ways. We used both new and non-traditional human rights-based approaches to public engagement to create what is a national museum, the first national museum to be established since 1967. And our mandate was to be dedicated to both the evolution, celebration, and future of human rights. At the time of its establishment, we were also the first national museum to be located outside of the national capital region of Ottawa. So that also brought both opportunity and challenges. We were the first national museum to be created with financial investment from multiple levels of government, as well as donations from private citizens, foundations, corporations, and labor unions. So what had become and started as the dream of one visionary, the late Israel Asper, led to a uniquely Canadian destination for human rights education and action. And it quickly became a reality and served to reflect the stories of Canada. Realizing this vision, the creation of a place that recognizes not only Canada but the world's human rights struggles and aspirations proved to be challenging and controversial. I think that would maybe be a bit of an understatement. I was 14 and looked very young when all this started. The museum overcame some of these challenges, and it continues to address these challenges. I don't want to pretend that the beginning and the opening of the museum represented an end. It really represents a beginning. So a beginning of an evolution of the museum. And part of what we needed to learn to do as a museum is careful listening and innovative thinking. And rather than assuming an authoritative museum voice, the creation of the museum was expected to be a model of collaboration as standard practice. And it sounds now, as it stands now, it's proving to be a groundbreaking and innovative museological experience that shares the global development of human rights concepts and Canada's role within it. So I tend to not like using negative comparisons, and at times when I talk about public engagement in a museum context, I use a comparison about traditional museum approaches and our museum's approach. So I mean this in all respect to traditional museums, but very often when we talk about a museum voice and a museum approach, it is that there are curators and subject matter experts that develop a storyline, write the text, and present it to an audience. So when we speak about a traditional museum and an authoritative museum voice, when you read museum texts and museum panels, it's this invisible voice, you're not quite sure whose voice it is. And very often traditional museum approaches do not involve public engagement. So that there is research, it is grounded and founded on the research and the advice of experts, but engaging the public in the development of a museum exhibit is considered to be innovative in the museum community. You know, in some presentations, that is important as a distinguishing feature because what we were doing in a museum context was not often done. And we're hearing more and more from other museums, not only in Canada, but around the world, that are grappling with difficult content to find strategies and ways to better engage the people whose stories they are telling. So it's no longer acceptable for the museum to tell the story of that community as a monolithic, one-sided community, but rather try to find strategies and ways to engage them and have that shared authority in the storytelling. So that is part of not a negative comparison, but when I talk about the traditional museum authoritative voice, that's a bit of what we were trying to move beyond. And so this collaborative approach is in keeping with a human rights-based approach. And certainly these rights and these values are of importance to Canadians. They're enshrined in our Canadian Charter, in our Bill of Rights, and in provincial human rights codes. And the Museums Act declares that the heritage of Canada and all its peoples is an important part of world heritage and must be preserved for present and future generations in its national museums. And our national museums are meant to play a role independently and in collaboration with other institutions to preserve and promote that heritage, and also contribute to this idea of our collective memory and our sense of identity, while serving as a source of inspiration, research, learning, and even entertainment. So when we're looking at human rights and seeing a museum not only as a venue where people come for education, but also come during their free time to learn, we also need to find strategies to engage and inspire them. And this is in service that is essential to Canadian culture. So through an unanimous vote, wrong button, there we go. Through a unanimous vote with the support of all political parties in Parliament, the museum was established through an amendment of the Museums Act, and the mandate of the museum recognizes the role that human rights plays as part of our heritage as Canadians. And that mandate is to explore the subject of human rights with special but not exclusive reference to Canada in order to enhance the public's understanding of human rights, promote respect for others, and to encourage reflection and dialogue. The reason I share that mandate is that when you are beginning a path of public engagement, you're striving to understand who the community, who the people that you're engaging with, what are their aspirations, who are they? But it's equally important for you to understand who you are, what is your mandate, and that you are also introducing yourself to the groups that you are engaging. And so we provide this context, and we talk about the responsibilities of the museum, because if you're going to build a relationship, it's not only about listening, but it's also about sharing what your goals are, what your objectives are, if you're really there to establish a genuine relationship. And that's a part of what we attempted to do through our public engagement. And as an ideas museum, our focus is on telling a story and enriching it with artifacts and objects, rather than exhibiting artifacts and objects with a story. And that provided a great deal of flexibility for museum developers, but was also at the core of the challenges that we had in developing our inaugural set of galleries. Traditionally, a museum is developed when someone begins to collect something, they don't have enough room, and then they create a space for that collection. We created a space to house an idea that is broad, diverse, intersectional, and so that's very exciting. But at a certain point, decisions need to be made, and you have to start landing on that decisions. And what we had to consider was whose perspectives of the past, the present, and future histories would be incorporated. How should they be positioned in a local, regional, and global context? And understanding that in the words of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. How do you implement that with a physical built experience in an engaging way that can have visitors be moved and learned? Again, no small feat. So we began speaking to Canada and Canadians about their contributions nationally. We recognized that we had to tell both the dark chapters of history related to human rights, and felt a keen sense of obligation to ensure that future generations can learn from those mistakes. And it's not to say that those mistakes are simply left in the past. They're ongoing intergenerational impacts. And the challenge of a museum with a living subject matter like human rights is that the day that we opened the doors in September 2014, human rights history didn't end on that day. Pick up a newspaper today. Did we think that we would be here when we opened our doors in 2014, when we were looking at a rise of white nationalism and a lot of these issues that were always there, certainly, but have become much more at the forefront of a lot of our public discussion and dialogue. So the content of the museum, or the content that we could continue to explore, is living and breathing. And so that is part of the challenge in public engagement. How do we play a role of a museum in the context of a subject matter that is continuing to evolve? And so part of what we recognized is that we needed to speak to people, and in 2009 we launched a vast public engagement process supported by a content advisory committee. It was completed in February of 2010, and it was really an unprecedented process where we met with over 2,000 people in 18 cities, and that meant at least one city in each Canadian province and territory. So we didn't do the let's hit something in the west, let's hit a city in the east, and let's go to the north. We visited every capital city in every province and territory, and in larger centers, we visited more than one. So certainly that was a great challenge. Of course, with public engagement, I recognize that in doing larger cities, you're also not reaching rural communities. And so you have to be conscious and aware of who you are reaching and who you are not reaching, and what does that mean in terms of your responsibility for additional reach and research. So very often in these large processes, for a lot of cost and logistics realities, you find yourselves going into these large centers. But as you begin to plan your public engagement strategies, acknowledging and recognizing who may be overlooked as a result is important in your planning and in your consideration of your findings. In these meetings, we were able to hear about the stories, controversies, and discussions that Canadians felt should be incorporated in the museums. The final decisions about which stories would be incorporated had not yet been made, and this process really helped shape our storyline, contributed to our research library and archive, and continues to inform our programming post-inauguration. Some stories were also used throughout the development of the museum to promote the process and help demonstrate how first-person narratives are powerful in telling human rights stories. The lessons that we learned in the first public engagement process informed our framework for ongoing dialogue. Public and community engagement became a hallmark. Prior to our opening, that dialogue was meant to maintain and grow public confidence in our work. Continued engagement through the entire content development process built relationship and ensured that our engagement was meaningful and ongoing. It also created controversy and public debate about which stories would be told and how they would be told. You need to recognize that as you begin to undertake public engagement, once the door is open to this type of engagement, it cannot easily be closed without harming your reputation and relationships that have been established. So that's really key whenever you begin to plan and develop a public engagement process. This type of engagement certainly has had a positive impact, but it allowed us to engage in broader public conversations as well. The entire process is also a reminder that when dealing with human rights discourse, memory, and history, they are not solely owned by scholars, historians, and lawyers. Public engagement was the foundation of our process because, as it was outlined in a recommendation in the report to the Minister of Canadian Heritage, in the establishment of the museum, it is important to empower and honor non-experts and citizens if new perspectives are to emerge from communities and diverse cultures. The CMHR has the responsibility and the opportunity to foster an understanding of the interconnectedness of the problems we face. It is in a position to both empower and honor all Canadians and also create a mission that focuses on the interconnectedness of our worlds and its challenges. Public engagement sought to engage these non-experts and citizens, whether they were frontline workers and NGOs, representatives from grassroots organizations, or individuals with an interest or lived experience related to human rights. And what that means, and what you'll see when you visit the museum, and what I'll continue to explore here is, at times people felt that we should use a multiculturalism type approach to the development of the museum. Prior to coming to the museum, I spent 10 years in the Department of Canadian Heritage, and a number of those years were working with the multiculturalism program. And in the 80s, multiculturalism was referred to at times as song and dance multiculturalism. Is anyone familiar with that term? Where everyone has their distinct culture, and it was much more about the food and the clothing and the celebration. In the 90s, we attempted to move into the realm of inter-community discussion and dialogue and breaking down barriers between communities, and not that we have a universal sameness, but that we have similar aspirations, we have similar hopes, and that by building relationship across communities, we can strengthen and better understand each other moving forward. And at times I feel like there is an expectation in the museum context, where is my space? Okay, so where is my space? Where is the gallery that's committed to Haitian Mennonites, born in Winnipeg? I'm also a woman, and where is my space? Where would I find myself? And as I drill into my own identity, there would be no natural space for my story to be told. So part of our challenge in the interpretation, and part of what we heard in public engagement, are those broader themes in terms of what people encountered. And what we needed to do was put them in a rights framework. And that is challenging when people are going to look for their particular story or their community story. So it's balancing what we're hearing from communities and then finding a human rights-based approach so that we don't simply say, I'm coming here to see my story, and I'm not interested necessarily in seeing the stories of others, and challenging ourselves to look a little bit deeper and find that interconnectedness, and that is fundamental to a human rights-based approach. But that forces us to go into areas where we are perhaps not comfortable. And that's part of the opportunity when we open with frankness and the generosity of the people who shared their stories. And they challenged and encouraged us to be inclusive, to be deliberative, and to be provocative. So not only did people from different backgrounds and vastly different points of view sit at the same table. We had sessions similar to the tables that you're sitting here. We did not assign seats. People sat at the table. We had a facilitator at each of the tables. And as people began to introduce themselves around the table, they started realizing that the only time they had encountered the other was perhaps when they were protesting against each other. And there were moments where that could have gone very wrong. This is not simple. But what we were able to do as a museum is create a place and a space where we set ground rules for the nature of the discussion and the dialogue. We had a facilitator there. We had a note taker so people would understand that their thoughts would be captured. And we facilitated a conversation around these broader themes. And it showed that public engagement is not just about what the museum needed to develop its exhibits. It's about what kind of place and space we could create to serve as a bridge for these vastly different perspectives to begin to encounter each other. Having those conversations with the other is not often easy. It's not a conversation that's easy to have at the water cooler. It's maybe not a conversation that you have within your social circle, because your social circle could be made up largely of people with a similar perspective. So part of what we tried to create within this public engagement process is how do we serve as a museum as a place to bring these sort of different perspectives, going back to our mandate in terms of enhancing understanding of human rights, encouraging reflection and dialogue. And what we try to do is find ways for people to begin to discover similarities and common ground, but also just providing them with tools for how to have conversation and discussion across vast lines. The process of public engagement that we took was not without its detractors. Some scholars and thought leaders warned that going to Canadians and non-experts and citizens and asking them what should be in the museum would automatically lead to divisive debates and create a competition of suffering. While some discussions did take on a competitive tone, they were in the minority. A majority of the people listened to each other, found meaningful connections between their stories, showed respect for each other, and demonstrated a genuine interest in wanting to learn from others. It's not that I feel that a lot of those detractors seriously underestimated the capacity of that non-expert to engage in an academic analysis of those issues, and underestimated the ability to engage in thoughtful human rights reflection and dialogue. And at the end of the day, in the context of human rights, we are all the expert in our story. And so to be called a non-expert if you have lived experience is condescending. So yes, certainly there were those detractors, but I think what we found is that there is a richness in individuals with that lived experience, and they can provide insight in a way that opens your eyes in meaningful ways. So today we find ourselves where our visitors and visitor satisfaction measures, kind of 96% are very satisfied, and visitors are leaving inspired. So we feel that some of those objectives in terms of leaning on that storytelling and leaning on non-experts create a story that relates to non-subject matter experts. It's not a museum by academics for academics. It's not a museum by experts for experts, and that also represented part of our challenge. Because even when you have a lived experience, the depth of your own personal knowledge in terms of the nuance, the historical context, can be quite great. And part of what we needed to do in creating that bridge was to understand what is the general public's level of knowledge and level of understanding. And as a community, we may be 3 or 4 years further ahead in our knowledge and our expertise than the general public. So at times what we needed to do was create a bridge. I'm still astounded today. You'll see the story of Viola Desmond within the museum. And as we went across the country in 09, 10, we had a number of people across the country saying, I never learned about this in school. And I mean, I think you could go into every story in the museum and you would have someone say, I never learned this in school. We all know that that's not necessarily, that breadth of the Canadian history is not necessarily taught. We have, and I'm not going to name them, but senior academics in the country come through the museum now and say, I did not know the story of Viola Desmond. People who have dedicated their lives to the study of Canadian history who did not know that story. So when you think of that bridge in terms of knowledge and understanding, it's not only in that general public. There are experts and historians who do not know some of these stories. And so I think that speaks a little bit to the bridge that we can create. And now we see a greater awareness and knowledge of the story of Viola Desmond, but part of what our challenge and opportunity is that it doesn't become an idealized story of the past, but we continue to make the link. And continue to work with community to speak about what are the contemporary issues so the story of Viola Desmond becomes an entry point into a broader conversation about ongoing racial discrimination, instead of a story that this happened a long time ago, she's been pardoned, and that's where the story ends. It cannot end there, and that's part of what people challenged us to understand through the public engagement process. So it's not that it was only public engagement. We paired the public engagement work and built a team of skilled professionals that led the content development process. It included academics and scholars with backgrounds in law, human rights, museums, research, archives, librarians, new media, design, exhibits, and interpretation. We worked with exhibit designers to ensure that all the necessary elements were included to create a unique and life-changing experience. The research team developed content packages to clearly articulate the objective and key messages of each of the galleries. And these were documents that allowed us to continue to develop and grow our work. But we quickly realized that we needed to go back to the communities that we had first engaged with. And so in 2010, we actually did a second round of public engagement. And this time, instead of simply listening, it allowed us to reflect back what we heard, demonstrate the impact of the initial exchanges, and continue the dialogue and discussion. And this process focused on these packages for each of the galleries, and the feedback provided was valuable and timely, and it allowed us to finalize the design. And it served as a part of an early audience evaluation. We were able to, through the second phase of public engagement, identify major gaps and oversights with sufficient time to adjust as possible. And I think that's key to public engagement. The cake cannot be fully baked when you go out to speak to the public. It needs to be done. You need to build it into your schedule to allow for meaningful change to be made if necessary. It was also a good process to allow us to affirm where we had successfully listened and reflected what we had listened. And it also became a very important process to identify significant areas of tension or potential conflict that needed close attention. And it demonstrated that we were committed to furthering the dialogue and building those relationships on an ongoing basis. And that we had to find the right balance of perspectives on controversial issues. It should be noted that even with a particular community or group of individuals with a lived experience, a diversity of interests and perspectives exist. At times, these perspectives vary geographically or on a local, provincial, and national level. Public engagement, building relationships, helped us and informed an understanding of this diversity of perspectives, and allowed us to recognize that at times not all perspectives would or could be adequately recognized. In addition to public and community engagement, solid academic and scholarly research were still critical to ensuring that the community memories were historically contextualized, and at times this caused tension with some communities or segments of communities whose perspectives may have varied. The reality is, in public engagement, there is a political process involved, and this caused tensions at times within communities or segments of communities whose perspectives may have varied. And the research definitely challenged the narratives that some communities wanted to promote. And it helped us to frame the exhibits conceptually and also garnered support from other members of those same communities. So these were the two large processes that we undertook to get us to our inaugural exhibit. But as I indicated in my opening, that represented the beginning and not the end. Since we've opened our doors, and I'm just going to jump to, these are more just like lovely pictures. You'll see a lot of them in the galleries later on. We have formalized public engagement in a number of different ways in our ongoing operations in the museum. We have a consultative, inclusive design approach, and we now have a formal inclusive design advisory council. They worked with us throughout the development of the museum, and they worked with us to help set new Canadian and world standards for universal accessibility for the physical building, for the exhibitions, and our programs. So this is a group of inclusive design experts with a wide range of abilities, and they test our products, they give us feedback, they meet frequently, and you'll see, if you have an opportunity to visit, our use of Braille, our use of simultaneous interpretation, but we also were able to innovate technology with Ryerson University, because in some of our early consultation, I would show an image like this, and someone who had mobility issues or was visually impaired said, well, I cannot engage with that. The technology did not exist. We were very excited about all of our touch screens. How do you function a touch screen if you cannot see it? So we were able to, by engaging and identifying that early, build it into the process. Very often, accessibility, if it comes at the end, well, suddenly you're talking about remediation, and there's a budget impact, and it starts creating barriers. But by building it into the design early on, it allowed us to incorporate it. And it did require some innovation, and now we're sharing that technology with other museums. We also have a number of different advisory groups that we're working with. And certainly in engagement with Indigenous communities is vital, not only from a human rights-based approach, but given the location of the museum and given our approach to ensure each gallery of the museum incorporated Indigenous content. And as a museum, building relationship with Indigenous peoples in a good way and contributing actively to reconciliation is certainly a priority. And that alone could be a whole 45-minute presentation, but what we've done is formally integrated in terms of the infrastructure of the organization. So we have a standing Indigenous Advisory Committee that is national in its scope. It provides overarching advice and support. We have an Indigenous Educator Working Group, and this is a working group. These are educators, experts, and elders, and they have actively worked with the museum on developing a program on Indian residential schools that we launched in 2017. They are actively working with us on an education program on Indian residential schools geared to older audiences. They have worked with us on a tour that we're going to be testing in the next few weeks on Métis rights. And we're working on an education program on the for early years, so for kindergarten to grade 3 students on Indian residential schools. So this is a group of educators that meet with us monthly, and it's a roll up your sleeve. They're helping us with the script, with the stops. It's active participation from the outset of the program. We also developed a tour called Mikanakea, which is a Spirit of the Building tour, and we worked with that with the Elder Circle 7. And they work with us on the development of the tour. They help us hire the staff, they train the staff, and they work with us on the marketing and promotion of the tour. And this is a collaborative and human rights-based approach to developing the project. I'm going to just share a little story, because at times when you think of the museum, you think of the physical built experience, you may think of education and public programs, but the impact of public engagement can inform all of the work of the museum. And Article 25 of the UDHR states that everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being of themselves and their family, including food. And so we had our operations team, the facilities, the team that makes sure that the lights are on and the building is heated, and they were trying to find ways to respond to the Standing Indigenous Advisory Committee. And so they began working with Damon Johnston, who's the president of the Aboriginal Council of Winnipeg, and he's also a member of our standing committee. And together, they developed a project that saw us repurpose some of the land on the museum for a community garden. And the community garden is being developed by CARD, the Council of Aboriginal Human Resources Development, and students from that program have come and they've seeded and they've tended to the garden. That includes corn, squash, and traditional herbs. The garden itself is circular in shape and divided in 4 sections meant to work as a traditional medicine wheel. And everyone is welcome to take what they need from the garden, and they will take the remaining fruits and vegetables for their community commercial kitchen. And certainly when we look at the Universal United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it speaks directly to traditional land and also traditional means of acquiring and growing food. And so a garden can be the output of meaningful public engagement. But it's not that our staff then took care of the garden. It's also in the implementation that we worked closely, and now they are acquiring job skills. This is something that these students can put on their resume, and we're continuing to find different strategies. So I just wanted to highlight that, because at times when we think of museums, when we think of public engagement in our hiring practices, we don't recognize that our operational teams and all aspects of the organization can be involved. I'm going to just speak a little bit to where stakeholder relations and public engagement rests now in the museum context. We have both a head of stakeholder relations and a senior leader responsible for Indigenous relations, and these senior advisors both report directly to the president and CEO. So we have put this as a priority institutionally, but it is not their sole responsibility to engage with these communities. And successful stakeholder and public engagement cannot be done off the corner of someone's desk. Whether it's our exhibitions, our programs, our human resources, our operations, communications and marketing, we all have an opportunity and a responsibility to engage. This means considering engagement in the earliest possible stages of a project. This is fundamental to relationship building. It can't be done if you are not committed to building trust, learning about who the public community person that you're engaging in is, but also, as I said, letting them know who you are and what you are trying to achieve. Because at times, those two things may not align. And you need to recognize that. But this whole process also means that you have to find ways to manage expectations. What are you committing to? What are you promising? And what can you genuinely fulfill? And at times that means a difficult meeting where you can say, yes, we can do this, but that's just not possible, and we're going to be open and frank about it, and that demonstrates a respect to them in some ways as well. While individual stories of violations that we present are unique and distinct, overarchingly, the themes of resilience and hope and perseverance of the human spirit transcended individual identities, and that's what we were challenged to share and to store. It's not a simple narrative of ongoing progress and advances of past, present, and future. We need to share the information of today's events and champions and invite ongoing participation in an ever-evolving conversation about human rights. And so that's what we have tried to achieve. That's what we're continuing to strive to achieve as we develop public programs now that are not only focused on telling one story, but bringing different communities together and creating a place and a space that we can learn from each other. Our inauguration not only represented an endpoint, but a beginning. And we look forward to continuing to learn from these strategies to deepen our content, develop our programs, and inform our policies moving forward. So I know that a number of you may be joining the tour this evening. So I encourage you as you look at the tour to see some of the exhibit components that use a bit of this strategy. As I said, I mentioned quickly some of the advisory councils that we're continuing to work with. And at times they are advisory in nature, and at times they are working group in nature. And I think it's important to understand the distinction and what you're asking in terms of level of commitment. But regardless of the nature of that advisory council as a museum, we ultimately take responsibility, and we are ultimately accountable for the final process. So it's also important that once something goes up on the wall, and if people are not, if there's controversy, you need to take that responsibility, and it's not, you have to continue to maintain that respect and that trust in the relationship. And you hear very often in the news when someone starts getting a little pressure, well, they told me. In a public engagement process that's built in trust, that's a very dangerous path to go, and it can really hurt your credibility moving forward. So we have a little bit of time for questions. I thought I would just kind of take them from the podium here, if that's okay. Yeah. Et je suis prête, si vous voulez poser des questions aussi en français, je suis prête à répondre à vos questions en français aussi.
Yeah. We have like 5 minutes, so I'm going to take one question. Is anybody very keen? Oh, sure. But
Yeah.
quickly. Any hands? Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, no, we need to use the microphone.
Oh, okay, yes.
Sorry. I was just wondering, so you said you have an advisory or working groups, committees. What level of compensation do you make for their time, and like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we have compensated their time. When we did our initial public engagement process, when we invited people to just share their thoughts, those individuals we did not compensate, but as soon as we began to formalize, whether it is our Content Advisory Council, our Standing Indigenous Advisory Council, our Indigenous Educator Working Group, we do pay for their time, and we also pay for any travel and deal with any of that type of accommodation costs. So I recognize that that's not always a reality for all organizations, and we have the, we're fortunate as a Crown Corporation that we build that into the project budget from the outset, and we ensure that those costs are considered. We do try to find strategies and solutions where for follow-up meetings we use conference calls, we try to use Skype, but I think very often when you're asking people for their advice and their time, they're either stepping away from paid employment or they're working for a volunteer organization where they're doing this at 8 o'clock at night after their paid job doing something else. And so I feel that if possible, it's important to find a way to compensate for their times, because at times that in itself could become a barrier to meaningful engagement. So I don't want to say that it's easy, but I find that in that way, it's another way of acknowledging their expertise. And if you're prepared to pay for a consultant, or if you're prepared to pay for some of the other things that at times we don't think twice of trying to find the budget for, just because the individual is a non-expert does not mean that 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 isn't something that you should consider in the same way as if you were going to hire a consultant. So I think trying to find a way. Now, our challenge is that at the beginning, the range is quite different depending on the amount of involvement in committee. So I don't have like a standard dollar amount. We're also trying to figure out what is an appropriate level of compensation. We look at what speakers, like we're doing a lot of research right now to say how do we move this forward, but we do usually pay for a full day, or if there's travel involved, we'll also compensate for some of that travel time. We've also been asked at times for childcare and how to support people to remove all of those barriers for their active participation. And so at times when we were on our Cross Canada Story Gathering, we also tried to find ways to help people with support for childcare, so that also didn't become a barrier to participation.
Thank you for that. I'll take two more. I saw your hand, and does anybody else have a question? Yeah, okay. I'll pass it on to you.
Merci. J'ai eu la chance de visiter le musée et je vais y retourner ce soir parce que je le trouve très intéressant. Mais est-ce que vous avez un projet de le rendre accessible à travers le Canada? Est-ce qu'il y aura des expositions itinérantes? Est-ce qu'on peut utiliser des outils pédagogiques? Est-ce qu'il va y avoir un musée virtuel? Comment mobiliser tout le Canada avec ce musée?
So just quickly, the question was just in terms of what are we doing beyond the museum's wall, whether it's a virtual museum or what we're doing to expand the reach. Alors certainement, on reconnaît que pas tout le monde a la capacité de venir à Winnipeg. Alors pour nous, au début, la priorité, c'était vraiment d'ouvrir nos portes. Mais on est en train de développer notre première exposition qui va être itinérante. Mais on est aussi en voie de développer un musée en ligne pour être capable de mieux engager les gens en ligne. Nous avons une blog, on est actif sur Facebook et sur Instagram et sur Twitter. Et c'est des outils qu'on utilise pour déjà engager les gens en tant que dialogue. Alors, nos blogs nous permettent de répondre à l'actualité et d'encourager les gens de réfléchir sur des questions actuelles. Mais ça prend de l'énergie et un investissement de temps parce qu'une fois que ces dialogues sont commencés, il faut quand même les gérer pour que l'espace virtuel est aussi sécuritaire que l'espace qu'on veut créer en personne. Alors, on trouve que en le faisant, on doit le veiller de près et c'est pas nécessairement entre nos heures d'ouverture parce que c'est les gens en ligne qui engagent à 10 heures le soir et là on rentre le matin et ce qu'on retrouve parfois en ligne en tant que langage, c'est pas ce qu'on veut créer comme espace. Alors on essaie de trouver des stratégies pour comment bien le gérer. So just we are working to better engage virtually. We're in the midst of developing our first museum exhibit that will begin to travel, but we're also doing a lot of work to expand our reach online with a virtual museum and online exhibits because we recognize that not everyone can physically come to Winnipeg. But as I was mentioning, it brings a whole other suite of issues. We've been using our blog on Facebook to encourage people to reflect on more contemporary issues and connect to some of our content. And what we found is that, as I was saying, we're trying to create a place and a space that is safe and respectful in person. How do you do that online? And we have at times posted a blog. You can't have people necessarily, we have filters that take explicit language off, and it needs our permission if there are swear words. But people have become savvy in their use of language, and so sometimes some hateful language does get through our filters. So part of what we're learning is how do we also create that safe space virtually, and how do we work with communities to be able to do that and to target those audiences. So that is now in the next phase, and in the next year or two, you'll see more robust online content, educational resources, as well as traveling exhibits. Yeah, merci.
Okay, we'll take the last two just before you answer.
Okay.
Let them both
Okay.
ask. And
Okay.
Hi, thank you. So yeah, you were talking a little bit about just consulting the public and citizens prior to the museum opening. I was just wondering, like, what maybe the age range and like kind of demographics of those citizens were, and then also in terms of like your staff and whoever was involved and even is like currently involved in the museum. Is there like, for instance, like training or like anti-oppression workshops, things like that that any of them get? It sounds like what your last answer. Maybe that's already been implemented, but yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to listen to the next question and then I'm going to answer.
Mine builds a little bit on that question because I was also curious about the people in the public engagement process in terms of the feedback during the development. But I'm curious about, are a lot of the people that are involved in that process the same kinds of people you would expect to be your audience at the museum? And also, if we think about engaging people on this spectrum of global citizenship, from awareness to understanding to taking informed action, what is the informed, do you see both or either one or both of those groups moving along that whole spectrum or only parts? And if they're at that informed action space, what types of actions are you asking or hoping that they'll be taking?
Yeah, thank you. So big questions. I'm going to just start. I always stayed away from the word consult because I think consult and engagement are two different things. And in a government context, consult is very much, I'm running something by you as I'm making my decision, and I've consulted so I can say that I got feedback. So I've always been very conscious of using the word engagement instead. So just a little thing that I found helpful in when I'm communicating and thinking, and as we're building the capacity within the team, what does genuine engagement be? And that's where we talk about relationship building and incorporating that in the earlier phases of the plan instead of like a rubber stamp consultation that sometimes it can become. We did, I think it's a great question, we did work with the Youth Advisory Council as well. And we did, as much as possible in some of our stops, we did sessions that did have more young people attend and participate. At times people came with their parents, and we tried to ensure and create a space where the youth voices had equal opportunity to contribute as some of the more established leaders in the community. And that is something that I think is very important, because very often the youth voices within a community may have very different perspectives than the more established community leaders who've been kind of in the field for 40 years. And so, but that's also, I think, where looking at digital engagement and other solutions to engage are ways to reach youth where they are. And also not only engaging them, but we do have programs now from kindergarten to grade 12, so they are an important audience ultimately. So as much as we worked with the educators, it's also developing youth. And yeah, training is something that is ongoing. And whether it be around themes of reconciliation, whether it be our own individual and personal knowledge, that is part of what we all are continuing to do, because I think we all come in with different level of understanding and different level of knowledge, and it's not that we're the expert on all human rights related issues, transcending that to our visitors. So ongoing learning is something that we have incorporated in the museum, which I think is important. In terms of our visitors, I think that certainly we would expect a number of the communities that we engage with to be our visitors. But we also, when I spoke a little bit to recognizing that at times, as you said, the communities are at that informed action, and I'm at early awareness. And at times what we had to do for a lot of our text panels is go more to that middle ground, because you know, when we did some early testing and we're trying to make it accessible in terms of language, a term like segregation is not plain language. And you cannot assume that people know what that means. We're doing some testing because we're developing an exhibit on Nelson Mandela. The testing showed people, oh, Nelson Mandela, know the name. Apartheid, no understanding, like very, very low understanding, which you'd think is surprising, right? And then suddenly you realize, oh, people are very comfortable with this Nelson Mandela as president figure, but have very little knowledge about his early struggles. So part of what we've tried to do with public engagement is understand where the community is, but you also have to do other audience testing as a museum to understand where your broader publics are, to start creating a starting point. Because if you start at informed action and I don't have base knowledge, we're not going to meet. And so at times I know that for communities, it is a point of frustration because the story doesn't necessarily reflect where they are in their community understanding. But that's where, when we try to communicate who we are and what we're trying to achieve, we need to impart that understanding that we're trying to reach a broader audience. And our approach very often is to attract that person who, oh, human rights, I'm not interested in that, and try to serve and create an accessible entry point so that they can start on that path. So certainly as we're looking at a number of our programs, whether it be our education programs, we have a program that we call Be an Upstander. So that's where we're actively imparting skills to empower people to take action for human rights. And we're developing advanced and professional programs. We're looking at now programs for educators. We have programs that we're looking to develop for police. We're looking at other groups that are already doing great work in that area because we're not trying to recreate. And that is where very often it's not through a self-guided hour-and-a-half visit that happens, but it's then connecting us with those programs. And that's where we're doing deeper engagement with communities. So we're doing a historic dialogue series, for example, on official apologies. So we worked closely with the local community around Indian residential schools. We've done one now on the Japanese internment apology, and we're actively working with the community in Halifax around the Africville apology to understand where are they as a community, what kind of conversation. And sometimes they're like, well, we're past that. We had the conversation, but what we're trying to say is, yeah, but what we're trying to do is bring the conversation to a broader community that is not aware. And so how can we work with you to expand awareness and knowledge? Because yes, the community has been talking to itself for a very long time, but what we can do as a museum is broaden that reach. And that means understanding that to start that conversation, we can't assume that everyone knows what Africville was or what the internment apology was. And so part of our programming then provides some foundational building blocks, and then we've used our blogs and other strategies to encourage people to learn more.
Thank you very much. I'm so sorry for putting pressure on, you know. Unfortunately, we did run out of time. Thank you very much. If we can put our hands together for Angela. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup pour votre temps.